In this video, I'm going to take you a long way back before the days of vibe coding, before Lovable and Claude Code, before single founders making millions of dollars in monthly recurring revenue on vibe coded SaaS apps that took them 30 minutes to build. So we're going way back. No, I'm just kidding. But what we are going to do in this video is we're going to talk about the fundamentals of software. And I'm going to basically explain what you're actually doing when you're using these vibe coding apps to avoid you hitting the failure that a lot of people are quietly doing, whilst it might not look like it on LinkedIn and X, but the issues that are keeping vibe coders from building anything that's actually production grade and keeping them in just the prototype and MVP realm. Now, my name's Adam. I'm a top 1% freelance on Upwork. I've done over 60 projects there. I've done over 250 as a global low-code agency founder. And long story short, I've been knee-deep in the AI development space for the last 5 years. And what I'm going to do in this video is basically expose a lot of the hype that is out there with these vibe coding tools that you're seeing on LinkedIn and X, but also talk about the source of truth or the gold that is in here amongst all of the other shiny objects, because there's serious potential with vibe coding and AI development. But what a lot of non-technical people are getting wrong is that you still need to understand the fundamentals of what you're doing. You don't need to understand every line-by-line piece of code, but you do need to understand how tech works and how to use these frameworks to build apps that are secure and scalable. This video is going to be a journey from zero understanding of tech to a very solid foundational understanding of the fundamentals of apps and how they work. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a lot of these non-technical founders and vibe coders are failing to build anything production grade, and you'll understand the path for you yourself to be able to build production grade apps with AI. So what we're going to be talking about in this video is 5 separate points. We're going to talk about the client versus the server. We're going to talk about authentication and security. We're going to talk about databases. We're going to talk about the front end and the back end. And then we're going to talk about AI and how it helps in all of these areas. Now, if this sounds confusing and overly technical, it is, but I'm going to try and explain it as simply as possible. And there's no shortcut. You need to understand what these are and how these work to actually be able to build production grade AI apps. So first off, we're going to talk about the client and the server. Now, simply put, the client is the interface that users interact with your app. So it's usually a web browser, whether that's on your phone or on your computer. We're talking Google Chrome, Safari, Firefox, whatever the case may be. And then we have the server, and this is where operations that relate to the actual operation of the app happen. Now, most people run their servers in the cloud, and so it's usually hosted by AWS or Amazon or Google or Microsoft. Now, as you build, you'll understand a little bit more about this relationship, but through an app, we're constantly sending messages, which are called API requests, back and forth between the client and the server to basically exchange data. Basically, how this works is that through your web browser, by logging into a platform, you exchange a username and password and login for a key, which allows you to access certain data on the server. A really basic example of this is for, let's say we've got a timesheeting and payroll application for employees. Each employee of a company can log into the platform. They can add a timesheet, which is a start hour, a finish hour, and basically they can send those forms or timesheets to the server to get stored in a database. And at the end of every week, that server will run an operation or a workflow to calculate all of the hours or timesheets submitted in that week, and then send them money based on how many hours they've worked in the week. As you can see in this example, the client is specific to each user. They see the timesheet history and the payrolls relevant to them as a person. And the server is where the calculations happen for each of these clients. So all of the sensitive information or access to the timesheets for each of these users is processed on the server. And so that way, people can't hack into other people's information. Now, that's a simple explanation of the client and the server. And what I'm going to touch on now is authentication and security. If we look at this little diagram, it explains exactly how this works. So when a user opens your platform, on the client, they basically add a username and a password. We send that username and password to the server because we can't run the authentication process on the client because client code is basically exposed and anybody can see it. So anything that's sensitive has to happen on the server. We send the credentials to the server checks whether those credentials are correct, and if they are, it sends back an access token. Now, this process is called the authentication process, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. But long story short, we get an access token back, and that access token allows us to send more requests to the server and return information that key can access. So if you think about it in really simple terms, that access token is just a key, and it can unlock certain doors or certain pieces of data in this database, but there's certain doors that might not want to be unlocked by that key, so they can't. And a common example for that is in this timesheet and payroll app. Let's say, for example, we have employees and then we have company admins. Company admins want to see the timesheets and timesheet reports for every user in their company, but they don't want the employees seeing the timesheet report for other employees. So the key or the access token that we get for employees allows them to only access data from the server and the database that's relevant to them. But if a company admin logs in, that access token or that key can unlock more doors, and it can unlock the doors for every employee to see the total timesheet reports across the entire company for every employee. So long story short, that is how authorization works. Now that leads us into the next bit, which is databases. Now, as you can see in this diagram, all of our data is stored in a database. Now we've got two kinds of databases. We've got SQL and NoSQL databases. In simple terms, SQL databases work the same as Excel tables in that we have a number of different sheets. Each of those sheets is a different data type. And in those data types, we have headings or column headers, and then we have rows. Now, really simply, let's imagine users. We have user tables, so we might have first name as a column, last name as a column, and then user ID as a column, and maybe email and profile image. And then we have an entire list of the users in our application. Now, if we want to create a relational database, let's say, for example, in our previous example, we have users attached to timesheets. So in the timesheet record, one of the columns could be the user ID, and that's how we link the user to the timesheet. And so if we wanted to run a search for users, maybe a history tab to see every timesheet they've ever added, we run a query to the database that goes fetch all of the timesheets in the timesheet table that have the user ID that equals this current user. So that's how SQL databases work. The other option is NoSQL databases. And basically what this means is that it's not a tabular structure. So one example of this is documents. So if we wanted to possibly store PDF documents or just documents in general, and each of those documents have different headings. So in the SQL database, in our example of users, if we had a user that maybe didn't have a profile image, that column would still exist. In an Excel, if you think about an Excel table, the columns always exist. They don't disappear. With a NoSQL database, I mean, there's lots of different ways that this can look, but typically for a document-based NoSQL database, the column headers for each row can be different. So we could have one user that has a first name, a last name, and an email in our document NoSQL database. The next user could have first name, last name, email, address, phone number, etc. It allows us to store data in a different way. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is vector databases. If you want to learn more about this, I've got a separate video that explains exactly how that works. And these are really popular right now because it's a new way of querying data and it's very AI friendly. But long story short, this allows us to query data in a Cartesian plane by plotting points in a Cartesian plane and drawing lines between data to find the shortest distances and pulling information that way. Now, finally, we're up to the front end and the back end, and it kind of links everything that we've talked about here together. It's very relevant to this little chart here. But when we talk about the front end, we talk about everything that's rendered in the browser or the client and everything that you see. So when you see dashboards, when you see tables, they're all front end components and they're compiled together in a combination of 3 coding languages. So when we talk about HTML, that basically just refers to the structure on the page, what colors, where everything's organized. We have CSS, which is the styles, so fonts, colors, etc. Then we have JavaScript, which is basic functioning. So when you click a button, where do you go? Which page do you go to? When you scroll down, what happens? Animations, all of that kind of stuff. So when we talk about that, we talk about the front end. When we talk about the back end, we talk about operations on data. So for example, in our previous the previous example we're using, at the end of every week, we need to compile every single timesheet that's been logged for each user. We need to build a timesheet report that has a breakdown of all of the hours they've worked, how much we owe them based on that user's hourly rate. And we want to convert that into a PDF that then gets automatically emailed to every person in the company. Those are back-end operations, and they happen on the server. So every app is a combination of front-end code and back-end code. Front-end code is exposed in the client, so we don't want to run any sensitive operations in the front end. And the front end happens on the browser. It's code that's rendered and happens in the browser. So it's in Google Chrome, in Safari, on our device, locally. Back-end code runs on the server, and that's typically hosted in the cloud, but it can also be, you can actually run a server on your own computer as well, but a lot of companies will run their own servers. But typically for most smaller companies, usually you'll run a server that'll happen in the cloud. Now, I know that is an information overload, but the good news is that if you get a grasp of these 4 things and how they all work, and as you build, you'll start to understand this more and more and more. But you need to understand these because for security, you need to make sure that all secure operations are happening on the server. Your database is secure. You've got authentication set up so that only certain users are basically retrieving the data that they should be retrieving. There's not data that's exposed to the general public. All this information, you need to understand the foundations of it to make sure that your application is secure. And that leads us into the 5th and final part, which is AI. And how do we actually use AI to help us? Now, the main thing about AI that you need to remember is that it's 80% planning and 20% execution. And one of the things that a lot of these vibe coders are getting really, really wrong is that they're jumping straight into tools like Lovable and V0, and they're just going straight away. They're implementing prompts and they're shooting from the get-go. Problem with this is that the AI doesn't understand the context well enough. You need to plan out your app really, really well and provide it context for it to actually generate accurate information. So before you even go to Lovable, before you even go to V0, you have to plan things out. And if you want to see how you can do that really, really well, I've got a video on the AI Builders Hub where I walk you through exactly how to build PRDs or product requirement documents, how to build MVP implementation plans, and how to build expected database design documents. So you're welcome to view that if you want to. But essentially, we need to understand this entire infrastructure. We need to build planning documents for how all of this is going to work. We need to provide it to these AI models to get accurate information and actually build secure and production grade AI applications. And it links me to this framework guardrails. So when we build, we want to have really clear planning documents that the AI can refer to understand what it's actually doing. And what I mean by this is things like the expected database schema, the tech stack, the user roles in your application. So you've got admins, you've got team members, whatever the case is. What data should those team members be looking at? What are specific security requirements that should be kept in mind? All that information should be living in your vibe coding instance so that the AI model actually understands what it has to do. And it remembers across conversations. So what might happen is you might log into these tools, you might play around in Lovable for a couple hours, log off for the day, come back in next week, start a new conversation, and it might start rewriting code that already exists in your app just because it can't remember or it doesn't understand that it's already written that previously. So the key thing with AI development is context and a basic understanding of the modular structure of your app. So what components exist in your app, what functions, what's your database, what are the tables in the database, how does authentication work? A basic understanding of all of that is going to mean that when you prompt these AI models, you don't need to understand every line by line piece of code, but you do need to understand the general framework of your app and how it works so that you can build really clear prompts and actually get output out of these AI models that is good in simple terms. So the key purpose of this video was to explain to you the fundamentals of tech, how it works, and why an understanding of this is critical to be able to direct and instruct an AI model to stay on track, not hallucinate, and build a secure and scalable application without duplicating functions, without duplicating tables, and without basically going off the rails. Now, there's a lot more to this, but without going back and understanding this properly, I really don't think there's much point in getting started in any of these vibe coding tools, because you need to get your head around these concepts first before you can even really begin to understand what's actually happening in these vibe coding platforms. So look, AI isn't going anywhere, and neither is the opportunity to build really quick AI vibe coded applications. But the real difference between people that build applications that are actually production grade and can do things and are secure, and people that are just building prototypes and MVPs, is going to be understanding what you're actually doing, so that you can navigate and control this AI instead of it controlling you and just sending you down some vibe coded path that you don't even understand. The real winners in this AI race are going to be product engineers. You don't need to be an expert at coding, but you do need to understand product, what's actually happening from a high level, and being able to control this AI so that it does a lot of the heavy lifting, but it does it in a way that you're project managing and you still have control. Now, if you want to learn more about building with AI, everything from high level skills like this to sales and how to sell yourself and how to freelance, but also technical skills with really popular tools like N8N, LLMs like Claude Code, and being able to use Cursor and Superbase and stuff like that, feel free to join the AI Builders Hub, which is where I'm releasing videos exactly like this one. But I hope that you found this helpful and you have a little bit more of an idea in your head around what's actually happening in these web applications, and it helps you formulate ideas and understand when AI might be going wrong and why security and building and understanding this structure correctly is crucial and really important to become a successful vibe coder and build actual production grade apps. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you again in the next one.